The system failed because it stopped listening to reality. No civilization collapses all at once, and no collapse begins with rubble in the streets. Collapse begins quietly, politely, with good intentions, comforting language, and policies that feel right in the moment, while slowly hollowing out the foundations that made prosperity possible in the first place. This video is not about attacking women, and it is not about assigning moral blame to individuals. It is about examining how female psychology, emotional framing, and identity driven narratives were deliberately weaponized by institutions, political movements, and economic elites to push policies that felt compassionate on the surface while producing long term instability beneath it. If you want to understand why birth rates are collapsing, why trust in institutions is evaporating, why men are quietly exiting society, and why the West feels poorer, colder, and more brittle with each passing year, you have to follow the incentives, not the slogans. The story of Western decline is not a story of villains twirling mustaches or conspiracies whispered in back rooms. It is a story of feedback loops. It is a story of how decision making shifted away from measurable outcomes and toward emotional validation, how disagreement was reframed as harm, how discomfort was treated as injustice, and how responsibility was slowly replaced with entitlement. Societies are complex systems, and complex systems cannot be run on feelings alone. They require trade offs, limits, accountability, and an acceptance that not every desire can be fulfilled without cost. When leadership structures prioritize emotional appeal over empirical results, the system becomes increasingly detached from material reality, and that detachment always ends the same way, with scarcity. For most of human history, men and women played complementary roles that balanced risk and stability. Men were socialized to deal with conflict resolution, delayed gratification, and long term planning because survival demanded it. Women were socialized to nurture, to maintain social cohesion, and to prioritize care because survival demanded that too. Neither role was superior, and both were necessary. The problem began when modern institutions attempted to flatten these differences, not by encouraging cooperation, but by pretending they did not exist at all. When political and corporate systems began elevating emotional reasoning as a primary decision making framework, they did so under the banner of equality, but what they were really doing was removing the brakes from a system that required balance. Emotional reasoning is powerful, it is persuasive, it creates immediate buy in, it makes people feel seen and heard, but it is also easily exploited. When policies are framed around how they make people feel rather than how they function in practice, accountability becomes optional and consequences are always deferred. If a program fails, the failure is reframed as underfunding. If a policy produces negative outcomes, critics are accused of lacking compassion. Over time, this creates a culture where results no longer matter, only intentions do. And when intentions replace outcomes as the measure of success, systems rot from the inside. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded over decades through education systems, corporate human resources departments, media narratives, and political messaging that consistently elevated emotional safety above material competence. The language changed first. Words like fairness, inclusion, and equity became untouchable, not because they were clearly defined, but because questioning them was framed as cruelty. Once language is captured, thought soon follows. Once thought is constrained, policy becomes untethered from reality. The result is a society that feels morally righteous while becoming functionally weaker. One of the most damaging outcomes of the shift has been the erosion of trust. Trust is the currency of civilization. People comply with laws, pay taxes, and cooperate with strangers because they believe the system is broadly fair and competently run. When institutions consistently prioritize optics over outcomes, trust collapses. People notice when resources are misallocated. They notice when standards are lowered. They notice when accountability is applied selectively. They notice when effort is no longer rewarded proportionally. And when trust collapses, participation collapses with it. Men, in particular, are highly sensitive to systems that feel rigged or incoherent. Throughout history, men have tolerated hardship, danger, and sacrifice when they believed their efforts contributed to a stable future. What they will not tolerate indefinitely is a system that demands responsibility without respect, contribution without authority, and compliance without reward. Over the last several decades, men were repeatedly told, both explicitly and implicitly, that they were the problem, that their instincts were outdated, that their role was unnecessary, and that the state or the corporation would replace the functions they once provided. Many men listened, and instead of protesting in the streets, they did something far more destabilizing. They disengaged. This disengagement did not look dramatic. It looked like fewer marriages, fewer children, lower workforce participation, less civic involvement, more isolation, more withdrawal into private worlds where effort still produced predictable results. Video games, online communities, and solitary lifestyles did not create this withdrawal. They merely absorbed it. When men concluded that the social contract no longer made sense, they stopped signing it. They did not revolt. They opted out. Meanwhile, many of the policies pushed under emotionally charged frameworks produced exactly the opposite outcomes they promised. Programs designed to eliminate inequality often entrenched it. Policies intended to increase safety often reduced resilience. Cultural narratives meant to empower ended up infantilizing. When empathy is applied without discrimination, it loses its moral clarity. Compassion that refuses to acknowledge cause and effect becomes indulgence. Over time, this creates what can only be described as toxic empathy, a condition where systems prioritize feelings in the present at the expense of stability in the future. The economic consequences of this approach are now impossible to ignore. Excessive public spending, justified by moral urgency, has created debt burdens that future generations cannot realistically service. Regulatory frameworks designed to protect everyone end up strangling productivity. Housing shortages worsen because incentives are misaligned. Energy costs rise because symbolic victories are prioritized over practical infrastructure. Each of these decisions is defensible in isolation when framed emotionally. Together, they form a pattern of decline. As these pressures mount, the narrative begins to shift. Suddenly, the same culture that dismissed men as unnecessary begins to wonder where they went. Social media fills with concern pieces about loneliness, falling birth rates, and the absence of stable partnerships. Governments quietly panic as tax bases shrink and welfare systems strain. Corporations discover that symbolic gestures do not generate profit. The system turns back to men, not with gratitude, but with expectation. The unspoken message becomes clear: come back, participate again, subsidize the system one more time. But systems do not get infinite chances. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Men who found peace in withdrawal are not easily convinced to re enter environments that previously punished them for existing. Many have recalibrated their expectations. They have learned to live with less, to need less, and to avoid entanglements that expose them to asymmetric risk. This is not bitterness, it is adaptation. When incentives change, behavior follows. The uncomfortable truth is that the West did not decline because women gained rights or entered the workforce. It declined because institutions abandoned balance. It declined because emotional appeal replaced empirical discipline. It declined because responsibility was decoupled from authority. It declined because leaders mistook moral language for moral outcomes. Women were not the architects of the system. They were the messengers and the justification. The architects were those who understood that emotional narratives could be used to bypass scrutiny, silence opposition, and consolidate power. Now, the bill has come due. The policies that felt good have produced hard constraints. The narratives that promised liberation have delivered precarity. The safety nets are fraying. The demographic math no longer works. And the people who were once told they were replaceable are being quietly asked to return. But history does not rewind so easily. Once people learn that walking away brings peace, they do not rush back into chaos. This is where the story is headed, and this is why it matters. Not because of blame, but because of lesson. Civilizations survive when they align incentives with reality. They fail when they confuse compassion with competence. If the West wants to stabilize, it will have to rediscover balance. It will have to revalue contribution, restore accountability, and accept that systems run on trade offs, not slogans. Whether it can do that before the damage becomes irreversible is the question that hangs over everything. And this is only the beginning. Large systems do not change course because someone makes a persuasive argument. They change when incentives force them to. For decades, the incentives inside government, media, academia, and corporate structures rewarded emotional signaling over measurable performance. Careers were built not on solving problems, but on managing perceptions. Funding flowed toward initiatives that sounded virtuous rather than those that demonstrated results. Once this incentive structure was locked in, anyone who challenged it was framed not as wrong, but as dangerous. Disagreement became synonymous with harm, and harm became a justification for silencing debate. This is how a society slowly loses its ability to self correct. Media played a critical role in this transformation. News organizations once competed on accuracy and insight, but as attention became the scarce resource, emotional engagement replaced factual rigor. Stories that provoked outrage, sympathy, or fear performed better than those that explained trade offs or unintended consequences. Over time, this created a distorted picture of reality where feelings were treated as evidence and anecdotes replaced data. When media narratives consistently frame policy debates through emotional lenses, public opinion becomes easier to steer but harder to ground. People begin to believe that disagreement itself is a moral failure rather than a necessary part of problem solving. Education systems reinforce this shift by prioritizing self expression over discipline and comfort over challenge. Young people were taught that their feelings were paramount and that systems should adapt to them rather than the other way around. While emotional intelligence has value, it cannot replace resilience, competence, and delayed gratification. When generations are raised to expect protection from discomfort, they enter adulthood ill equipped to navigate competitive, resource constrained environments. The result is a population that demands solutions without accepting costs, and leaders who promise the impossible to maintain approval. Corporate environments mirrored these trends. Human resources departments evolved from managing logistics to enforcing cultural conformity. Policies designed to reduce conflict often ended up suppressing honest feedback. Performance metrics were softened to avoid hurt feelings. Risk aversion increased as accountability decreased. Innovation slowed, not because talent disappeared, but because the cost of failure became reputational rather than operational. In such environments, the safest move is to say the right thing, not to do the right thing. Over time, this produces organizations that look progressive on paper while becoming fragile in practice. As these dynamics intensified, the economic foundation began to erode. Productivity growth slowed. Infrastructure aged. Public debt expanded. These were not isolated problems, but symptoms of a deeper issue. When systems prioritize emotional satisfaction, they tend to overpromise and underdeliver. Each unmet promise requires a new narrative to explain why results fell short. This creates a cycle of escalating rhetoric and diminishing returns. Eventually, reality intrudes. Resources run out, demographics shift, External pressures mount. At that point, no amount of messaging can substitute for material constraints. One of the most consequential constraints is demographics. Birth rates across the Western world have fallen below replacement levels, not by accident, but as a predictable outcome of cultural and economic incentives. Family formation requires stability, cooperation, and long term commitment. When narratives frame independence as the highest good and portray interdependence as weakness, fewer people choose to build families. When economic systems make housing unaffordable and child rearing financially punitive, even those who want families delay or abandon the idea. These choices accumulate over time, creating population structures that cannot sustain existing social programs. Governments respond to these trends with short term fixes. Immigration is increased to offset labor shortages. Monetary policy is loosened to stimulate consumption. Welfare programs are expanded to cushion economic shocks. Each of these measures can provide temporary relief, but they also introduce new tensions. Social cohesion weakens when integration fails. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Dependency grows as productivity stagnates. The underlying issue remains unresolved because addressing it would require acknowledging trade offs and resetting expectations. That is politically risky in a culture accustomed to emotional reassurance. This brings us back to men and their quiet withdrawal. Men are not a monolith, but as a group, they are particularly responsive to incentive structures. When effort leads to progress, they engage. When effort leads to punishment or indifference, they disengage. Over the past several decades, many men observed that traditional paths to stability were narrowing while expectations remained high. They were told to contribute, but not to lead, to provide, but not to decide, to be responsible, but not authoritative. This asymmetry is unsustainable. Eventually, rational actors exit systems that extract value without offering commensurate reward. The cultural response to this exit has been confusion and denial. Commentators ask why men are not stepping up, as if effort can be summoned by moral exhortation alone. Others pathologize withdrawal, framing it as a social illness rather than a rational response. Few are willing to ask the harder question: what incentives would make re engagement worthwhile? That question forces an uncomfortable reckoning with policies and narratives that have prioritized feelings over function. Meanwhile, the consequences of disengagement compound. As fewer men participate fully in the workforce, tax bases shrink. As fewer families form, consumer demand shifts. As social trust declines, transaction costs increase. Each of these changes feeds back into the system, increasing pressure on those who remain. The burden grows heavier, and the appeal of opting out increases. This is not a crisis of masculinity, it is a crisis of institutional credibility. At the same time, many women find themselves caught in the crossfire of these systemic failures. Promises of effortless independence collide with economic reality. Careers that were supposed to provide fulfillment and security often deliver stress and precarity. Social narratives that discouraged reliance on men did not eliminate the need for cooperation, they merely deferred it. As costs rise and safety nets strain, the gap between expectation and experience widens. This creates frustration, not because independence is inherently flawed, but because it was sold without acknowledging trade offs. The result is a cultural stalemate. Institutions cannot easily reverse course without admitting error. Media cannot recalibrate without sacrificing engagement. Politicians cannot tell the truth without risking office. Men see little incentive to return to systems that previously dismissed them. Women are left navigating a landscape where support structures are weaker than advertised. Everyone feels the strain, but few can articulate its source without violating taboos. History offers many examples of societies that reached this point. They share common features. Moral certainty replaces practical wisdom. Symbolic victories substitute for material progress. Responsibility is diffused while authority is centralized. Eventually, the system either reforms or fragments. Reform requires humility, honesty, and a willingness to accept short term discomfort for long term stability. Fragmentation occurs when those qualities are absent. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. The path forward is not about turning back the clock or reviving outdated norms wholesale. It is about restoring balance. Emotional intelligence must be paired with empirical discipline. Compassion must be bounded by accountability. Equality must be reconciled with competence. Men and women must be allowed to contribute in ways that align with their strengths rather than be forced into ideological templates. Most importantly, institutions must relearn how to tell the truth about trade offs. Until that happens, the trend of men walking away will continue, not as a protest, not as a movement with banners and slogans, but as a series of individual decisions made quietly and rationally. Each man who steps back reduces the load he carries and increases the strain on the system he leaves behind. This dynamic is not driven by resentment, but by calculus. People respond to incentives. Systems that ignore this reality do so at their own peril. The coming years will test whether the West can adapt. Demographics will not reverse overnight. Debt will not disappear through rhetoric. Trust cannot be commanded, it must be earned. Re engagement will require more than apologies or campaigns, it will require structural change. Whether leaders are willing or able to enact such change remains uncertain. What is certain is that denial is no longer an option. The cracks are visible, the numbers are clear. The silence of disengaged men speaks louder than any protest. They have already voted with their feet, their wallets, and their attention. The question is not whether this trend exists. The question is whether the system will acknowledge it before the cost becomes irreversible. One of the defining features of the current era is the normalization of abstraction. Problems are discussed at such a high level of moral language that their concrete mechanics disappear. Housing becomes a question of fairness rather than supply. Employment becomes a question of dignity rather than productivity. Security becomes a question of feelings rather than deterrence. This abstraction allows leaders to appear compassionate while avoiding the hard work of solving root causes. It also makes dissent nearly impossible because anyone who points out practical constraints is accused of lacking empathy. In such an environment, policy becomes performance, and performance is rewarded regardless of outcome. This dynamic is especially destructive when applied to economic systems. Our markets are not moral entities. They respond to incentives, scarcity, and risk. Attempts to moralize them without understanding their mechanics lead to distortions that punish the very people they claim to protect. Rent controls reduce housing supply. Excessive regulation drives small businesses out of existence. Monetary expansion erodes savings. Each of these effects is well documented, yet they persist because acknowledging them would require admitting that good intentions are not enough. Emotional narratives make it easier to dismiss inconvenient data as heartless. As these distortions accumulate, inequality deepens in unexpected ways. Those with access to capital, information, and mobility adapt. They move assets optimize taxes, and navigate regulations. Those without such access bear the brunt of policy failure. This creates a paradox where systems designed to promote equality end up entrenching stratification. The rhetoric grows more intense as results worsen because leaders must explain why outcomes do not match promises. The gap between words and reality becomes a source of cynicism, especially among those who are expected to shoulder the cost. Men are disproportionately represented in the groups most sensitive to this gap. Trades, manufacturing, logistics, and technical fields rely on clear rules and measurable outcomes. When regulatory environments become unpredictable and culturally hostile, participation declines. Men notice when standards are applied inconsistently. They notice when effort is decoupled from reward. They notice when loyalty is treated as liability. Over time, these observations coalesce into a simple conclusion. The system no longer deserves full engagement. This conclusion does not require ideological agreement or collective action. It emerges organically as individuals compare effort to return. When that ratio deteriorates, withdrawal becomes rational. This withdrawal takes many forms. Some men reduce ambition, choosing stability over advancement. Others avoid long term commitments that expose them to asymmetric risk. Many retreat into private domains where rules are clear and outcomes are proportional to effort. These choices are not driven by hostility toward society, but by a desire to preserve autonomy and peace. The cultural response to this trend has been largely superficial. Campaigns encourage men to open up emotionally while ignoring the structural factors that drive disengagement. Initiatives focus on changing attitudes rather than incentives. This reflects a broader misunderstanding of motivation. Feelings follow conditions, not the other way around. You cannot message people into participation when the underlying exchange feels unfair. Without addressing material realities, cultural appeals ring hollow. At the same time, institutions continue to expand responsibilities without restoring legitimacy. Surveillance increases in the name of safety. Compliance requirements multiply in the name of fairness. Each new layer of oversight reduces individual agency while promising collective benefit. But collective benefit depends on trust, and trust depends on reciprocity. When people feel monitored but not protected, regulated but not rewarded, compliance erodes. The system responds with more control, creating a feedback loop that accelerates alienation. Women, too, experience the consequences of this dynamic, though often differently. Many were encouraged to pursue independence without being told about the costs. Careers were framed as substitutes for community rather than complements to it. Delayed family formation was presented as empowerment rather than risk management. When economic conditions were favorable, these choices seemed viable. As conditions tighten, the fragility of these narratives becomes apparent. Independence without support networks is not freedom, it is exposure. This realization is beginning to surface in cultural discourse, though often indirectly. Discussions about loneliness, mental health, and work life balance reflect a growing awareness that the promises of the previous era were incomplete. Yet, acknowledging incompleteness would require revisiting foundational assumptions. It would require admitting that some traditional structures existed not to oppress, but to stabilize. Such admissions are difficult in a culture that equates critique with regression. The political system is ill equipped to navigate this moment. Electoral incentives favor short term relief over long term reform. Leaders who propose structural changes face backlash from entrenched interests and emotional constituencies. It is easier to borrow, spend, and reassure than to recalibrate. This postpones reckoning, but increases eventual cost. Every year of delay compounds demographic imbalance, fiscal strain, and social fragmentation. History suggests that societies often attempt symbolic resets before embracing substantive change. New slogans are introduced, old policies are rebranded, committees are formed. These actions create the appearance of responsiveness without altering incentives. For a time, this can maintain stability. Eventually, however, reality asserts itself. When promises repeatedly fail, legitimacy collapses. At that point, reform becomes reactive rather than proactive, driven by crisis rather than foresight. The men walking away phenomenon is both a symptom and a signal. It indicates that a significant portion of the population has concluded that engagement no longer makes sense. It also signals that the social contract has frayed beyond rhetorical repair. Contracts rely on mutual benefit. When one side consistently bears cost without commensurate return, renegotiation or exit follows. Men have largely chosen exit not because they reject society, but because society rejected the conditions under which they were willing to participate. This exit has cascading effects. Fewer mentors for younger men, fewer stable households, less informal social regulation. Communities weaken as participation declines. These losses are not easily replaced by programs or policies. They are emergent properties of trust and cooperation built over time. Once eroded, they cannot be restored through decree. The irony is that many of the values championed by emotional governance depend on the very structures it undermined. Equality requires abundance, inclusion requires stability, safety requires competence. When these foundations weaken, the ideals built upon them falter. This creates a cycle of disappointment where ideals are blamed for failures caused by their misapplication. The result is polarization rather than understanding. Breaking the cycle requires a shift in perspective. Instead of asking how policies make people feel, leaders must ask how they function over time. Instead of framing trade offs as cruelty, they must explain them as reality. Instead of suppressing disagreement, they must invite it. This is difficult in a culture accustomed to validation, but it is necessary for renewal. Men will not re engage because they are scolded or shamed. They will re engage when systems once again reward contribution, respect competence, and offer predictable outcomes. Women will not find stability through narratives alone. They will find it through structures that support cooperation and shared responsibility. Both require institutions willing to prioritize function over performance. As we move forward in this analysis, the picture becomes clearer and more unsettling. The trends described here are not slowing. Technological change accelerates displacement. Fiscal constraints tighten. Cultural fragmentation deepens. The margin for error shrinks. At such moments, societies either rediscover realism or descend into managed decline. The choice is not abstract. It is being made every day through policies enacted, incentives set, and narratives promoted. Men walking away is not a cause of collapse. It is a response to it. Ignoring that response will not reverse it. Understanding it might. At this point, the discussion can no longer remain theoretical because the consequences of prolonged denial are no longer abstract projections. They are measurable, observable, and accelerating. Systems that drift too far from reality eventually encounter moments where correction is no longer optional. These moments are rarely announced. They arrive disguised as budget shortfalls, labor shortages, declining service quality, and rising social friction. The public senses something is wrong long before leaders admit it. Confidence erodes quietly, and once lost, it cannot be restored through messaging alone. One of the most revealing indicators of systemic stress is the behavior of institutions themselves. When organizations lose confidence in the narratives they promote, they compensate by increasing control. Rules proliferate, monitoring intensifies. Compliance replaces competence as the primary measure of success. This is not strength, it is defensive behavior. Institutions that trust their legitimacy do not need constant enforcement. Institutions that fear scrutiny rely on it. The expansion of surveillance and regulation across Western societies is not a sign of stability. It is a sign that voluntary cooperation is declining. This decline is intimately connected to the erosion of shared meaning societies function when people broadly agree on what constitutes contribution, fairness, and success. When these definitions fracture, coordination becomes difficult. Emotional governance accelerates this fracture by elevating subjective experience above shared standards. If everyone's truth is equally valid, then no common metric exists to resolve disputes. Power fills the vacuum left by consensus. Decisions become less transparent, more arbitrary, and increasingly resented. Men respond to this environment with predictable caution. In systems where rules change without warning and accountability is uneven, risk avoidance becomes rational. Long term commitments require confidence in continuity. Marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, and civic leadership all involve delayed rewards and exposure to downside risk. When institutions appear unstable or hostile, opting out becomes a form of self preservation. This is not apathy, it is prudence. The withdrawal of men from these roles has second order effects that compound over time. Young men lack mentors who model responsibility and restraint. Informal norms weaken as fewer people feel invested in enforcing them. Communities lose stabilizing influences that once mitigated conflict. These losses are not immediately visible, but they accumulate quietly until disorder becomes noticeable. When that happens, leaders often respond with more formal controls, further accelerating disengagement. Economic pressures intensify this cycle. As productivity stagnates and costs rise, households face increasing strain. Dual incomes become necessary rather than optional. Time scarcity replaces financial scarcity as the dominant constraint. Under these conditions, family formation becomes more difficult, not because people reject it in principle, but because the opportunity cost feels too high. Emotional narratives cannot offset structural disincentives. When reality contradicts rhetoric, reality wins. The labor market reflects these tensions. Employers struggle to fill roles that require long term commitment or physical effort. Training pipelines thin as fewer young people see value in mastering difficult skills. Credential inflation substitutes for competence, raising barriers without improving outcomes. Meanwhile, essential work becomes increasingly invisible until it fails. Only then does its absence become obvious. This pattern repeats across sectors, from infrastructure to healthcare to education. Political discourse grows more shrill as solutions become harder to implement. Polarization intensifies because simplified narratives are easier to sell than nuanced explanations. Each side accuses the other of malice while ignoring systemic incentives that shape behavior. Emotional appeals dominate campaigns because they mobilize support quickly, even if they undermine trust in the long run. This creates a feedback loop where leaders are rewarded for saying what feels right rather than what works. As trust declines, informal cooperation gives way to transactional interactions. People rely less on community and more on contracts. Relationships become conditional and cautious. This shift has cultural consequences that extend beyond economics. When cooperation feels risky, people retreat into smaller circles. Social fragmentation increases. The sense of shared fate diminishes. Under such conditions, appeals to collective responsibility ring hollow. Women navigating this environment face their own set of challenges. Many internalized narratives that promised fulfillment through independence alone. When those narratives collide with economic and social constraints, disappointment follows. The absence of reliable partnerships amplifies vulnerability rather than reducing it. Support structures that were assumed to exist prove fragile. This realization can feel like betrayal, not because independence is undesirable, but because it was framed as sufficient. The resulting tension often manifests as mutual misunderstanding. Men perceive demands without appreciation. Women perceive absence without explanation. Both experiences are shaped by systemic forces larger than individual choice. Yet public discourse rarely acknowledges these forces. Instead, it personalizes outcomes, assigning blame rather than examining incentives. This approach satisfies emotional impulses but prevents resolution. History suggests that societies reaching this stage often oscillate between denial and overcorrection. Initial responses minimize the problem. Later responses exaggerate it. Neither approach restores balance. What is required is sober assessment and institutional humility. That requires leaders willing to admit that some policies failed, that some narratives were incomplete, and that some trade offs were unavoidable. Such admissions are rare in environments where moral certainty is prized. The men walking away phenomenon underscores the limits of cultural engineering. You cannot compel engagement through messaging. You cannot shame people into commitment. You cannot regulate trust into existence. Trust emerges when systems demonstrate fairness, competence, and predictability over time. Rebuilding it requires consistent behavior, not grand gestures. This rebuilding process would involve reevaluating assumptions about work, family, and responsibility. It would involve acknowledging that incentives matter more than intentions. It would involve restoring respect for contribution, regardless of ideology. Most importantly, it would involve recognizing that men and women are not interchangeable units, but complementary participants in a shared project. Ignoring these realities does not eliminate them, it merely delays confrontation. Technological change adds urgency to this reckoning. Automation and artificial intelligence alter labor markets faster than cultural norms can adapt. Roles that once provided identity and purpose disappear or transform. Without stable institutions to manage transition, displacement breeds resentment and withdrawal. Emotional narratives cannot substitute for retraining, opportunity, and security. Systems that fail to provide these will lose legitimacy further. Fiscal constraints loom as well. Aging populations strain pension systems and healthcare budgets. Fewer workers support more dependents. This imbalance cannot be corrected through optimism alone. It requires either increased productivity, higher participation, reduced benefits, or some combination of all three. Each option involves trade offs that must be explained honestly. Avoiding explanation postpones decision but worsens outcome. In this context, the appeal to men to re engage without structural change appears increasingly unrealistic. Men who withdrew did so after evaluating conditions. Re entry would require evidence that conditions have improved. Symbolic gestures are insufficient. So are appeals to duty that ignore reciprocity. People invest where they see return, not where they are scolded. The silence of disengaged men is often misinterpreted as apathy. In reality, it is communication. It signals that the system failed to meet expectations. Ignoring that signal is costly. Systems that dismiss exit as irrelevant soon discover that participation was more valuable than they realized. By the time the loss becomes undeniable, options narrow. The path forward remains uncertain. Renewal is possible, but it requires abandoning comforting illusions. It requires leaders willing to prioritize function over optics. It requires media willing to explain complexity rather than amplify outrage. It requires institutions willing to reward competence and accountability. Most of all, it requires a cultural shift away from emotional absolutism toward pragmatic cooperation. Men walking away is not destiny. It is feedback. Whether that feedback is heeded will determine the trajectory of the West in the coming decades. Societies that listen to feedback adapt. Societies that silence it decay. The choice is ongoing, made not in speeches, but in policies and incentives enacted day by day. As the system continues along its current trajectory, the margin for correction narrows, and this is where patterns from history become instructive rather than academic. Civilizations do not collapse because people stop caring. They collapse because the structures that convert care into coordinated action stop functioning. When incentives misalign for too long, even well intentioned populations lose the ability to act collectively. What follows is not chaos all at once, but stagnation, sclerosis, and a gradual lowering of expectations until decline feels normal. One of the clearest signs of this normalization is how failure is redefined. Where failure once meant unmet objectives, it now means unmet feelings. Programs are evaluated based on how they are received rather than what they produce. Metrics become ambiguous. Benchmarks are softened. Success is declared through press releases instead of results. This redefinition protects institutions from accountability, but deprives them of learning. Systems that cannot admit failure cannot improve. Over time, they repeat mistakes with increasing confidence. This environment rewards a particular type of leadership, not leaders who solve problems, but leaders who manage narratives. These figures excel at framing setbacks as progress, delays as victories, and constraints as moral challenges. They speak fluently in values while remaining vague about mechanisms. Such leadership thrives in emotionally driven cultures because it provides reassurance without demanding sacrifice. The cost of this style is paid later when reassurance runs out and constraints remain. As institutions drift, informal systems attempt to compensate. Families, communities, and peer networks absorb strain that formal structures cannot handle. This works temporarily, but only when those informal systems are strong. When they weaken, as they have across much of the West, the strain becomes visible. People feel unsupported, friction increases, trust erodes further. The system responds by expanding formal controls, which further undermines informal cooperation. The cycle tightens. Men stepping away from full participation accelerates this process because men historically occupied many of the roles that stabilized informal systems, not because of ideology, but because of distribution. They staffed trades, enforced norms, mentored youth, and absorbed risk. When they disengage, these functions do not disappear immediately. They degrade. The loss is gradual, but cumulative. Eventually, gaps become obvious, and replacing them proves difficult. Attempts to fill these gaps through policy often misunderstand their nature. You cannot legislate mentorship. You cannot mandate trust. You cannot program commitment. These are emergent properties of stable incentives and shared purpose. When policymakers attempt to substitute bureaucracy for culture, they create expensive systems that perform poorly. The result is frustration on all sides. Those who comply feel burdened. Those who withdraw feel vindicated. The conversation around responsibility illustrates this misunderstanding. Responsibility is frequently framed as obligation without authority. People are told to be accountable for outcomes they cannot influence. This breeds resentment rather than engagement. Genuine responsibility requires agency. When agency is constrained by rules, monitoring, and shifting standards, responsibility becomes performative. People go through motions without internal commitment. Systems appear busy while achieving little. Women operating within these systems encounter a parallel problem. They are often encouraged to take on responsibilities without corresponding support structures. Expectations rise while resources shrink. Emotional validation substitutes for practical assistance. Over time, exhaustion sets in. This exhaustion is not a personal failing. It is a predictable outcome of misaligned incentives. When narratives emphasize empowerment without addressing load, burnout follows. The cultural response to burnout is often therapeutic rather than structural. Individuals are encouraged to practice self care, set boundaries, and manage stress. While these strategies have value, they do not address root causes. You cannot meditate your way out of systemic overload. Without structural change, personal coping strategies merely delay breakdown. The focus on individual adjustment deflects attention from institutional responsibility. This deflection is convenient for leaders. It shifts blame downward while preserving existing arrangements. If people struggle, the explanation becomes resilience rather than design. This framing is deeply ingrained in emotionally governed cultures because it avoids confrontation. Yet avoidance carries its own cost. Problems left unaddressed do not disappear, they intensify. The economic dimension of this intensification is stark. As productivity growth lags and debt rises, future options narrow. Governments face hard choices between funding commitments and maintaining credibility. Central banks attempt to smooth cycles through policy tools that lose effectiveness over time. Asset prices inflate while real wages stagnate. The gap between financial narratives and lived experience widens. Trust suffers accordingly. Men, evaluating these conditions, adjust expectations downward. They choose paths that minimize exposure. This often means rejecting traditional milestones that once anchored social life. Marriage, homeownership, and long term careers become optional rather than assumed. Critics interpret this as immaturity or avoidance. In reality, it reflects risk management. When systems are unstable, flexibility becomes rational. The cumulative effect of millions of such decisions reshapes society. Consumption patterns change, housing markets distort, social institutions lose members, political coalitions fragment. None of this is coordinated, yet all of it is connected. The system experiences what engineers would recognize as load shedding. Stress is redistributed until failure occurs in less protected areas. Cultural narratives struggle to keep pace with these changes. Stories about progress persist even as indicators decline. This dissonance creates cognitive strain. People sense inconsistency but lack language to describe it without violating norms. Silence becomes safer than honesty. Public discourse narrows. Private conversations grow more candid. The gap between public and private understanding widens. At this stage, the risk of abrupt correction increases. Systems that suppress feedback tend to experience sharper failures when constraints assert themselves. Gradual adjustment requires open discussion of trade offs. Without it, pressure builds unseen. When release comes, it is disruptive. History shows that societies which avoid incremental reform often face sudden reorganization. The men walking away phenomenon functions as early warning. It indicates declining willingness to absorb systemic strain. Ignoring it does not preserve stability. It postpones adaptation. Each year of delay raises the cost of eventual change. Leaders who dismiss disengagement as marginal misunderstand its significance. Participation is the lifeblood of complex systems. When it declines, everything else follows. The path to renewal, if it exists, will not resemble past eras. It will require integrating lessons learned rather than reverting to nostalgia. It will require acknowledging that emotional intelligence and empirical discipline must coexist. It will require rebuilding institutions that reward contribution and competence while respecting human limits. Above all, it will require honesty about constraints. Honesty is difficult in cultures trained to avoid discomfort, yet, discomfort is the price of learning. Societies that accept this reality adapt. Those that do not drift until forced to change. The West now faces that choice. It can continue to manage decline through narratives and controls, or it can confront reality and rebuild trust. Men will not be compelled back through pressure or persuasion alone. They will return when systems demonstrate reliability, fairness, and respect. Women will find stability when support structures align with expectations. Both depend on institutions willing to change how they operate, not just how they speak. As the endgame approaches, the defining feature of the moment is not outrage, but fatigue. Societies nearing inflection points do not erupt immediately. They tire. People stop arguing. They stop persuading. They stop trying to fix systems that no longer respond to effort. Fatigue is the quiet companion of decline, and it is more dangerous than anger because it drains the energy required for reform. When fatigue sets in, participation becomes selective, conditional, and minimal. People do what they must and little more. The social surplus that once fueled innovation and cohesion evaporates. Fatigue emerges when expectations repeatedly exceed results. Every cycle of promise and disappointment teaches people to lower their hopes. This learning process is rational, it is also corrosive. When optimism becomes a liability, realism turns into withdrawal. Men, having been conditioned by experience to associate engagement with diminishing returns, are often the first to internalize this lesson. Their retreat is not dramatic, but it is consistent. It shows up in fewer risks taken, fewer commitments made, and fewer hours invested beyond necessity. Institutions respond to fatigue with acceleration rather than reflection. They push harder, communicate louder, and demand more compliance. This response misunderstands the problem. Fatigue is not caused by insufficient messaging, it is caused by insufficient payoff. When effort does not translate into progress, pressure backfires. People conserve energy, they disengage further. The system interprets this as resistance and escalates. The cycle tightens again. At the cultural level, this dynamic produces a strange inversion. The language of care becomes more prominent as care itself becomes rarer. Compassion is invoked constantly while support structures weaken. Inclusion is celebrated while participation declines. These contradictions are not accidental. They are compensatory signals meant to reassure in the absence of substance. Over time, people learn to discount them. Words lose weight. Trust erodes further. The demographic implications of sustained fatigue are severe. Low birth rates are not merely a function of preference, they are a signal that people do not believe the future will reward long term investment. And children represent faith in continuity. When faith declines, fertility follows. No amount of cultural encouragement can override economic and social signals that suggest instability. This is why incentives matter more than narratives. People read conditions more accurately than slogans. Governments attempting to reverse demographic decline often focus on surface level measures. Subsidies are offered, campaigns are launched, yet these efforts rarely address the underlying calculus. Family formation depends on confidence in housing, employment, education, and social stability. When these foundations feel uncertain, marginal incentives are insufficient. People make decisions based on trajectory, not snapshot benefits. The labor market reflects similar calculations. Workers prioritize flexibility over advancement. Short term contracts replace long term careers. Loyalty becomes transactional. This is not a moral shift. It is adaptive behavior in a netco environment perceived as unstable. When institutions no longer offer security, individuals create their own buffers. This increases resilience at the individual level while reducing it at the systemic level. Men's withdrawal amplifies these trends because it removes a stabilizing counterweight. Historically, men absorbed risk in exchange for status, authority, and long term payoff. When those rewards diminish, the bargain collapses. Risk remains, but incentive disappears. Rational actors exit. This exit is often mischaracterized as laziness or entitlement. Such labels obscure the real issue, which is broken exchange. Women navigating the same environment encounter a different set of trade offs. Many find themselves carrying dual burdens without commensurate support. Work expands while community contracts. Emotional labor increases as formal systems falter. Burnout becomes common. The cultural response often individualizes the problem, encouraging personal adjustment rather than institutional change. This perpetuates exhaustion and frustration. The political consequences of widespread fatigue are predictable. Voter turnout declines. Cynicism rises. Extremes gain attention because they offer clarity in a landscape of ambiguity. Moderate voices struggle because nuance requires trust, and trust is in short supply. Policy debates become symbolic rather than substantive. The distance between governance and lived experience widens. Media ecosystems accelerate this divergence. Algorithms reward emotional intensity. Simplified narratives crowd out complexity. Outrage becomes a substitute for understanding. People retreat into information silos that confirm their perceptions. Shared reality fragments. Under these conditions, collective problem solving becomes increasingly difficult. Without common ground, coordination fails. As coordination fails, systems rely more heavily on coercion. Rules multiply, penalties increase, surveillance expands. These measures can enforce compliance but cannot restore legitimacy. In fact, they often hasten its decline. People comply minimally and resentfully. Informal cooperation withers. The cost of enforcement rises. The system becomes brittle. Brittleness is the enemy of resilience. Resilient systems absorb shocks and adapt. Brittle systems appear stable until they fracture. Emotional governance tends to produce brittleness because it discourages honest feedback. Problems are smoothed over until they cannot be ignored. When they surface, they do so abruptly. Men walking away should be understood in this context. It is not a rebellion, it is a signal of brittleness. It indicates that a significant portion of the population has stopped providing shock absorption. When stress increases, there is less capacity to absorb it. Failures cascade more quickly. And the question many avoid is whether re engagement is still possible. The answer depends on whether institutions can change behavior, not just language. Re engagement requires restored reciprocity, it requires predictable rules, fair enforcement, and tangible reward for contribution. It requires respect for competence and acceptance of trade offs. These are not radical demands, they are basic conditions for participation. Restoring these conditions would involve uncomfortable shifts. Some policies would need to be repealed or revised. Some narratives would need to be retired. Some interests would lose advantage. Such changes provoke resistance from those who benefit from the status quo. Emotional framing is often used to shield these interests from scrutiny. This makes reform politically hazardous. Yet, the cost of inaction grows. Each year of delay deepens demographic imbalance and fiscal strain and social fragmentation. At some point, constraints force action regardless of preference. The question is whether action occurs through deliberate reform or crisis driven reaction. History favors the latter when denial persists. The cultural adjustment required is substantial. It involves redefining success in terms of sustainability rather than symbolism. It involves valuing maintenance as much as innovation. It involves recognizing that care without structure is insufficient, and structure without care is unstable. Balance must be restored not through nostalgia, but through design. Men's role in this redesign is unavoidable. not because men are superior, but because their participation is integral to system function. Excluding or marginalizing a large segment of the population reduces capacity. Re engagement will not occur through appeals to guilt or duty. It will occur through credible demonstration that the system has changed. Women's role is equally critical. Sustainable systems require cooperation, not competition framed as liberation. Independence must be paired with interdependence. Empowerment must include responsibility matched with support. These concepts are not opposites, they are complements. As fatigue deepens, the appetite for honesty grows. People may resist uncomfortable truth, but they crave coherence. Leaders who articulate reality clearly and propose credible paths forward can rebuild trust incrementally. This requires courage because honesty invites criticism. Yet, the alternative is managed decline. Managed decline is not neutral, it redistributes pain unevenly. Those with fewer resources suffer more. Inequality increases. Social tension rises. The moral language that once justified policy choices loses credibility. Cynicism hardens. At that stage, reform becomes far more difficult. The silence of disengagement is often misunderstood as absence. It is presence expressed differently. It is a withdrawal of energy that once sustained institutions. Reversing that withdrawal requires more than acknowledgement, it requires structural change. Every complex system relies on voluntary contribution far more than it relies on force. Laws, markets, families, and communities function because most people comply even when they could evade. That compliance is not automatic, it is earned through predictability, fairness, and competence. When these qualities erode, compliance becomes conditional. People do the minimum required and withdraw the surplus energy that once drove progress. This is where the West now finds itself operating on residual momentum rather than renewed commitment. The central failure has been the elevation of emotional affirmation above functional outcomes. Emotional intelligence is valuable, but it cannot replace empirical discipline. When feelings become the primary metric of success, systems lose their capacity to self correct. Feedback is filtered, trade offs are denied, costs are deferred. Eventually, constraints assert themselves. At that moment, no narrative can substitute for preparation. Men's withdrawal has been particularly destabilizing because it removes a key stabilizing force, not because men are uniquely virtuous, but because their historical role involved absorbing risk in exchange for long term reward. When that exchange was disrupted, rational adaptation followed. Men did not disappear, they recalibrated, they reduced exposure, they opted out of arrangements that no longer offered proportional return. This behavior is often moralized or psychologized, but it is best understood as economic and institutional feedback. Women have been caught in the consequences of this feedback as well. Many were encouraged to believe that independence alone would deliver security and fulfillment. When that promise collided with rising costs, shrinking support networks, and institutional fragility, disappointment followed. This disappointment is not a personal failure, it is a systemic one. Independence without stable systems is vulnerability by another name. The tragedy of the moment is that both men and women are responding rationally to the same environment. Yet public discourse frames them as adversaries. This misframing benefits institutions that prefer conflict between groups over scrutiny of structures. As long as frustration is redirected horizontally, it does not travel upward. Emotional narratives thrive in this space because they personalize outcomes and obscure incentives. The future of the West will not be decided by debates about identity or symbolism. It will be decided by whether institutions can restore credibility. Credibility is built through consistent behavior, not declarations. It requires policies that work, rules that are enforced evenly, and leadership that explains trade offs honestly. It requires admitting that some well intentioned ideas produced harmful results and that adjustment is necessary. Re engagement is still possible, but it will not be easy. Men will not return because they are told they should. They will return when systems demonstrate that contribution is valued, competence is respected, and risk is shared rather than imposed. Women will not find stability through slogans. They will find it through structures that support cooperation, family formation, and sustainable work. Both depend on institutions willing to change how they operate, not just how they speak. The hardest obstacle to reform is not opposition, it is inertia. Systems built on emotional governance resist change because acknowledging failure threatens legitimacy. Yet legitimacy erodes faster when denial persists. History shows that societies which confront uncomfortable truths early avoid harsher corrections later. Those that delay are eventually forced to change under worse conditions. The men walking away phenomenon should be understood as a diagnostic signal. It indicates that the social contract no longer feels reciprocal to a large segment of the population. Ignoring that signal will not make it disappear. Pathologizing it will not reverse it. Only structural reform can address it. Such reform would involve rebalancing rights with responsibilities, compassion with accountability, and inclusion with competence. It would require restoring respect for productive contribution regardless of ideology. It would require creating environments where long term commitments make sense again. None of this is simple. All of it is necessary. As technology accelerates change and fiscal constraints tighten, the cost of dysfunction rises. There is less room for error. Systems that function tolerably under abundance struggle under scarcity. Emotional governance, which depends on excess capacity, becomes untenable. Realism returns, either by choice or by force. The path chosen will shape the next generation's prospects. If reform occurs deliberately, pain can be mitigated and trust rebuilt. If reform is postponed, adjustment will be harsher and more uneven. The window for the former remains open, but it is narrowing. Men walking away is not an endpoint. It is a warning. It tells us that participation cannot be taken for granted. It tells us that incentives matter more than intentions. It tells us that systems must earn loyalty rather than demand it. Whether that message is received will determine whether decline continues or renewal begins. Before closing, it is important to speak directly to those who stayed to the end. If you made it this far, shout out to the 1 hour gang. You are the people willing to sit with complex ideas rather than settle for comforting shortcuts. And if you're enjoying these angry guy videos, you can show support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep this work going. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed? Do you agree with this analysis? Where do you think the system went wrong, and what would it take to fix it? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter more than most people realize. Like the video, if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.